Hi, this is Sheila from Seaside Snuggles Quilts, Patterns, and Crafts, where I focus mainly on quilts, but will craft anything that tickles my fancy. Today, we're going to make this 12 by 18 inch Arizona State flag block. This block can be used in a quilt to make a little pillow, to make a cute bag, whatever you like. In this video, I'm going to show you how I drafted it and cut that pattern apart, paper pieced it, and ended up with this final result. If you're interested, I hope you'll join me, and let's get started. So here I have a piece of freezer paper taped down, and I've already drawn my 18-inch by 12-inch rectangle and divided it into 4 quadrants. So the next thing I need to do is mark the circle that's going to define the boundaries of my star. So I found this document on the Vexillology subreddit, and I used the numbers there to adjust my measurements for this 12-inch tall by 18-inch wide block, finished measurements. Now already I've made a mistake, because if you're into vexillology, I'm going to have to practice saying that word, and have done any research into the Arizona state flag, you know that the center of the star is not actually in the center of the quilt. So at this point, I'm taking all the steps, but I'm going to have to erase it and redo it. But I'm going to explain just so that it makes more sense when I do make the adjustment. So the diameter of the circle that you'll be making for the star is 50% of the height. The height is 12 inches, so the diameter of the circle is 6 inches, making the radius 3 inches. So I drew a 3-inch radius circle, and then I divided it into 72-degree sections. 360 degrees are the number of degrees in a circle, divided by 5, which is the number of points in our shape, is 72. So I made a mark at 72 inches to the left and to the right of vertical, and then I made another mark at 144 inches, which is 2 times 72, to the left and to the right of center. Those are where the points of my stars are, and then I connected the dots. This is where I figured out that I had misplaced the star. The center of the circle that will define the star should actually be dropped below the center of the flag, and that measurement is 5/16 of an inch. I rounded it. So I marked down 5/16 of an inch from center, and then I remarked 3 inches to the left and right, top and bottom of that mark, and then I used my compass to redraw the circle. And then I was cooking with gas. So from this point, I'm going to get my compass, and I'm lining up the 0 and the 180 degrees on the vertical line, and I'm making a mark at 72 degrees and 144 degrees from the top on the left and on the right. Then it's a matter of connecting the dots, kind of like you would for a just drawing a hand star. First thing I did, though, is I marked from those points on the circle to center, and then I started connecting across the star to complete each leg. And there I have the star. So I also marked points around the outside of the square where the rays should be. So starting from the horizontal line up, I had a mark at the 2-inch mark. Then I marked another 2.5 inches above there. Then I should have a 1.5-inch space to the corner. And then across the top to center is 2 inches, then 2 5/8 of an inch, then 2 inches again, then 1.5 inches, and finally 7/8 of an inch to center. and then you just duplicate those marks on the other side at the top of the quilt. So I wanted to clean up my radius before I drew the other rays. And this ray here, because I had to make an adjustment for rounding, it wasn't landing quite in the right position, but I decided to accept it the way it was and just clean up inside the star with intentions of redrawing my stitch lines and cut lines after it was cleaned up a bit. So I'm just kind of looking at where that line would be, and all of the rays intersect at the actual center of the flag, and I decided to stick with that instead of trying to make it hit the star in the right place. So that's what I was checking there. Now all of my rays are drawn. So now my flag is complete, and I just need to figure out how I'm going to assemble it in the paper piecing process. And what I decided to do, I had of course already given this some thought, is to connect the lines from that first ray because they don't go to the center of the star. I needed to make an adjustment. It's not aligned with the center of the arms of the star either. It's a little bit higher. So I decided to go ahead and paper piece it based on that first ray. Then I decided to piece under the arms, and I think that's a good look for the star. And to be able to finish that star, I need a seam coming off the legs in one direction or another, and it needs to come off this way. So now that I have it figured out how I'm gonna piece this thing, I need to go in and number my sections. And I'm looking at how the colors are gonna be and getting ready to mark everything. So the first thing I want to do is I want to mark the pieces that are going to be separated. So I'm just darkening my cut lines. This is where I'm going to cut my pattern apart. So I have those two diagonal lines coming in and a vertical line. Then I'm labeling each section of the 4 sections, top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right, keeping in mind that a paper piece pattern is pieced in reverse. It's the mirror, but because this is symmetrical left to right, I don't need to really think too hard about flipping things around, but I do want to label it correctly. Now I'm numbering my pieces, the pieces in the order that they'll need to be sewn together. And if there's an option, I'm considering, should I flip the seam allowance or not? So on my initial numbering here, I'm just going from left to right. And then I think about it, and I was going to mirror it, but I want all of my seam allowances to go in the same direction. And after considering what side's going to be the left and what side's going to be the right, I figured out that I need my seam allowances to nest the other direction if I want my seam allowances to kind of be pressed into one another to give me nice tight seams. So I changed my numbering and went the other direction. And that's just me talking to myself, thinking about the direction of the seam allowance. I want my seam allowance on the, what's going to be the right hand side to go up. So, all right, so everything is numbered. An advantage of using freezer paper is that you can flip your seams as you go. And that way you don't have to flip your seam after you cut it from the paper, because that will kind of change the size of your seam allowance. So if you can flip it before you square everything up or before you move to the next step, that will help maintain an even seam allowance. So after I have all my numbers in, I want to mark my colors so that I get those placed in the right direction, and that's what I just did. And I'm just checking. Let's get ready to cut this out. I'm thinking about my fabrics here. These are the fabrics that I'm going to use. The star in the center of the Arizona flag is copper colored, so I'm using that orange color. Also, before I cut this apart, I want to mark where I'm going to need to add seam allowance to the cut edges. I'm going to add seam allowance around the outside. Just as I cut it, I'm cutting 1/4 inch away from my line. But when I cut the whole thing apart through the center, I'm not going to have seam allowance there. So I just wanted to write little reminders on either side of the cut lines to add seam allowance. So that's what I was doing first. Now I'm going to cut straight down the center, and then I'm going to cut on the diagonal line that separates my flag into 4 parts. The next step is to fold along all of my stitch lines, and I like to fold with the print on the outside or my drawing on the outside, and then flip it so that the fold is towards the face of the pattern, because as you're sewing your paper piece pattern together, you're going to need to fold towards the print side. So I just want to go ahead and get those folds established before I get started, so that I don't have to try to get an accurate seam after I've stitched it onto my fabric. If you're using regular paper, I recommend that you do these folds as well. There is a little trick where you can press some seams in the direction that you want by stitching like you're using freezer paper after the main body of your section is attached to the paper. You can kind of use the same trick that you would on freezer paper to flip your seams. And maybe I'll go over that in another video if you're interested, but I digress. Make sure that you fold all of your folds in advance. It will make your life easier. I know a lot of people say it's optional, but I've tried it without folding it first, and it's just so much easier to get the folds knocked out. Another trick, if you have a lot of sections, the number of folds that you have will be the number of pieces on a section minus 1. So for instance, this piece I believe has 8 pieces of fabric. So you'll have 7 folds to make on each of those top pieces. So here's where we're going to start paper piecing. So I've cut myself some rectangles that are oversized for what I need, so that I can use the cut off for the rest of the pattern. So that rectangle looks really big, but I wanted to make sure that I had about 1 inch extra so that the piece that I'm going to cut off, I can use for the next blue section on the quilt. And when you place your first piece, you want to place it right side down. And then when you place your second piece, you want to place it right side up. So see how I made that mistake there? It should be right side up. Notice how I have my number 2 piece folded. I can use that folded piece to make sure that my second piece of fabric is properly positioned. When I position this, I need to make sure that I have at least 1/4 inch off the edges that don't have seam allowance included. And I like to have a little bit off of the edges that do have seam allowance included so that I can trim it to size. Next, we have the second half of the bottom piece. You want to make sure that you lay down that second piece of fabric right side up with your pattern folded. You want to align that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure that you have 1/4 inch all the way around, and then pin. And then you're ready to pin the next piece. So here I'm just eyeballing what size piece of fabric I'm going to need. And when I place this, I need to place the pattern piece. So the number 1 piece is touching the fabric right now. I just have the rest of the pattern folded. And I like to place it so that if I have a straight edge, it is 1/4 inch from the fold from the beginning. And that's kind of one less cut I need to make. So that's what I'm doing here. I have it folded, and I'm checking that I'm 1/4 inch from the fold, and that entire section has coverage all the way around plus 1/4 inch. Once I have it positioned, I'm going to open up the paper and secure it by pressing. Freezer paper adheres to fabric without leaving any residue when you peel it away. That's why I love it so much. And because I'm not tearing the paper apart, when I finish the pattern, I can use it again several times. So I really, really love using freezer paper for paper piecing. Give it a try. So my second piece on each of these is going to be red. I'm doing both of the top pieces now. And I just want to clean up the top edge that I'm going to use to align with the first piece of fabric that I have. So that piece that's folded, you can see the wedge that red needs to cover, and you can see I have full coverage all the way around. And I just lined up that 1/4 inch with the yellow 1/4 inch seam allowance and pinned it out of the path of my presser foot so that I don't have to remove a bunch of pins. Because I have all of my seam allowances going, I believe, counterclockwise, I'm not starting on the seam section on the opposite piece as I did on the first piece. So I'm trying to keep in mind as I piece this that I want to, keep some of my scrap big enough that I can use it later in the raise. I hope that makes sense. So let's go sew this first 2 pieces together. When you stitch using freezer paper, you're going to keep the paper folded and you're going to stitch right beside the fold. If you're using regular paper, you're going to unfold your pattern and you're going to stitch on top of and through the paper, right on top of the stitch line that's drawn. So those are the 2 main differences with the piecing part of using freezer paper versus regular paper. So here, I did a weird stitch and it folded my paper kind of weird, so I just took it off. I'm going to remove those stitches and then I'll re-stitch it. And then just keep it moving. Like it's pretty simple. So I had a weird stitch there. My paper is still attached because it's pinned and it's ironed. And I'm just going to restitch it. And I want to make sure that I stay right next to the fold. If you're sewing on white paper, if you're sewing on white fabric with white paper, it's a little difficult to see. So if you're doing this for the first time, I recommend using colored fabric and you'll have an easier go of it. So now I'm cutting a 1/4 inch away from the line between the next 2 pieces. So between 2 and 3. But first I cut between 2 and 4, which is that blue piece, because I want to use that scrap blue piece later. I didn't want to cut it in line with that leg and then not be able to use it later. I hope that makes sense. I cut it so that I could use it to fill in that piece later. And then I cut between 2 and 3. And then I cut between 2 and 3, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I cut a piece of fabric long enough for that star leg, plus a 1/4 inch all the way around, plus a little more where I don't already have seam allowance. And then I'm just going to give it a pin. And that's ready to go. Making sure it's nice and flat. You don't want to have any buckles or anything there. So on the raise, I'm folding between piece 2 and 3. I'm cutting the seam allowance a 1/4 inch away from the fold of the paper. And then I'll add my next piece, which will be a yellow piece. So I have a lot of yellow off this edge. I'm making sure I have at least a 1/4 inch beyond the edge there because the seam allowance is not there. And now I can use that piece for the next ray. I'm making sure I have full coverage by peeking underneath that shape, making sure I have at least a 1/4 inch all the way around the shape. And now that piece is ready to sew. Next, I'm trimming off my excess red because I just don't want that flopping around. I'm making sure I leave 1/4 inch. Then I'm going to fold back the piece that I want to save and cut 1/4 inch away from the fold there. And then I'm going to fold between my piece number 2 and piece number 3, cut 1/4 inch seam allowance, and now I'm ready to align the piece for that star leg, which is the number 3 piece. My fabric's not directional, so I don't have to pay too close attention on this copper colored fabric to how it's placed. And now we have the rays on the other side. I'm folding between 2 and 3. I'm cutting 1/4 inch away from the fold. And now I'm ready for a red piece. And I'm looking through my scraps, seeing which one's gonna fit this short piece because I want to conserve my longer pieces for the outside of the rays. The red fabric's not really directional, so I can place it, however. Just making sure I have full coverage around the shape that is folded over. So you're looking at the shiny side of the freezer paper to see the shape. And then we're just going to sew right next to the fold again. So this one, be careful. The paper gets really thin on some of these sections. Make sure that your presser foot doesn't get up under the paper. If it does, stop, pull the whole thing out from under the presser foot, and get yourself resituated. Also, when you're ironing, I know it looks like I'm touching the iron to the paper, but I'm not. I'm only using the edge of the iron on the fold when the fabric side is up to press that seam down. And then when I flip it over, I'm giving another press because you need to press it from the paper side for it to adhere to the fabric. So fabric side, I'm just using the edge of my iron, not touching the iron to the shiny side of the freezer paper, and then pressing again from the front. So now we have 3 pieces on and we're ready to put the 4th piece on. So now we're cutting between 3 and 4. And we're going to use the scrap that we cut off the original rectangle. Now, I'm confusing myself unnecessarily here. When your pattern is open and you're trying to compare your fabric, you want your fabric to be face down. If the pattern is open, the fabric should be face down. So wrong sides together on both the paper and the fabric. If your paper pattern is folded, then you want your fabric to be right side up. So right sides basically would be facing each other if your pattern is folded. So just keep that in mind. If you have one thing on the right side and the other thing on the wrong side, then it's incorrect. So this is a pretty close fit. I just wanted to peek and make sure that I had at least 1/4 inch all the way around that triangle shape before I pinned it. And now that one's ready to go. So finger pressing, then I'll put some heat right on the fold. And you can't really tell that my iron is tilted there, but I'm not touching that shiny part with the iron. And then I'm pressing the whole thing from the front. Now I'm reasserting my fold between 3 and 4, cutting 1/4 inch seam allowance. Same thing here. Reestablishing my fold between 3 and 4. Now I'm ready to place my next pieces, which is piece number 4. So this fabric is directional. It clearly has a horizontal stripe or vertical stripe, depending on how you use it. I used those stripes to get the aesthetic that I wanted in my sunflower block. If you watch that video, this is the same fabric. And I wanted my horizontal stripes to kind of curve around with the rays. And so by placing my stripes perpendicular to the folds I was able to achieve that look. If I wanted it to radiate out, I would have had to cut that striped fabric so that I had longer sections for the rays, and then I would have made sure that my rays were parallel to the folds, and that would kind of give me, you know, a radiating look with the fabric. But after you get the third piece on, all the subsequent pieces are placed the same. You're just gonna trim a 1/4 inch from the fold, place the next piece on, make sure that you have coverage all the way around, plus at least a 1/4 inch, and secure it with some pins, and then go sew next to the fold. I debated whether or not I wanted to leave the sewing machine sounds in there, and I decided not to leave them on there for this one. Let me know if that's better or not. Okay, so we're getting there. We have one more piece for the bottom left and bottom right. So I probably could have used this piece, but it was just too close for comfort because I have two sides that do not have seam allowance there, so they would have been very, very close. And instead of risking it, I just decided to cut some larger pieces. Now, I fixed it here. I flipped my piece of fabric over so that it was right side up, which is correct when my pattern is folded. So basically right sides together, right? Then we'll prepare this one. Finger press. I'm going to press that seam nice and flat, make sure it's fully folded out. Now I should have pressed on the right side as well, but it's okay. And see there? Oh, I almost did it, right? Almost did it the wrong way, but you know, we all make mistakes. The trick is correcting them, right? All right, so those two pieces are ready to sew. I didn't show you the sewing part on that. It's pretty repetitive. Fourth piece on. You want the seam nice and flat. That's what I'm concentrating on here. And then when I flip it over, you concentrate on adhering it to the back of the freezer paper. So here's that fourth piece of the star on. Sorry, fifth piece. So the top left and top right are done. So from this point, we're going to just continue with the, bottom left and bottom right are done. So from this point, we're going to continue with the top left and top right. We have a lot of seams coming together there in the center, but they're going to be cut away when we get the star sections on there. So if it's not perfectly aligned, it's really not that big a deal. It really isn't. So we're just repeating our steps that we did for the other sections after section 2. So that red corner is the piece that I need the biggest piece of red for. And I do want to say it looks like I'm just whipping through this, but I have this whole video at double speed, so I'm not this fast. So I'm just setting that bottom left and bottom right aside for now while I continue with the top left and top right. So here I'm just comparing because I know I have a long yellow piece that I need, but I have a short yellow piece on the side that I'm working on, and I wanted to cut a piece that would be something that I could use for both sections. So that's what I was just eyeballing there. And in this case, I'm doing something a little different. I'm placing it and then I'm cutting it because I'm trying to conserve that large triangle of yellow for the other side of my raised section. All right. So we have 2 more sections to sew as part of the raise, and then we'll be able to put our stars on, our star point sections on. I'm really happy with the way this came together. This is kind of, the prototype. And as I was saying in the introduction, so this one, I wasn't able to just fit it on an edge, so I'm kind of maneuvering it around to make it fit that piece of fabric that I had remaining. Make sure that that fabric is face up before you cut it to size. And just giving myself some pins. But as I was saying, I wasn't able to fit the complete bottom left and right on a single piece of 8.5 by 11.5 inch sheet of paper. It wouldn't print that way, part would be cut off. So I do have extensions on there for you to attach. If you're using freezer paper, I recommend that you print out the print, stick it together using some tape, and then trace it onto a single piece of freezer paper. If you just want to sew right through your paper, make sure that you're using some type of heat resistant or at least heat tolerant tape, or just use a glue stick, stick it together, make sure that it's thoroughly dry. Don't put the glue too close to the edge so that you don't get that on your iron. All right, last raise added on to the top left and the top right. So we'll get that ironed and trimmed, and then we'll do the last 2 sections, which will be for the star. Whenever you have like a bunch of excess fabric like hanging off, just trim it. Don't try to trim it to size. Just get some of that hanging off so you don't accidentally sew over it. So even there where I trimmed it, I used my ruler, but see my 1/4 inch seam allowance? I still stayed away from that because I want to square the whole thing up at the end of each section. And this again, I decided that I didn't want to try to get too tight a fit, but I remembered that I had these scraps from the bottom sections that I could use in this really narrow sliver of star point. So same thing with the other side. I'm cutting my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and see where all those seams come together there. It winds up being cut out. So that's why I said not to worry about it if they didn't come together perfectly. And also remember that this part in the center does not have the seam allowance included on the pattern, so you need to leave plenty of fabric so that you will have a 1/4 inch seam allowance in the end. And in the star center, both edges need to have that seam allowance added. Isn't it amazing how a paper piece pattern comes together? Like, it's one thing when you're putting it together, but when to kind of watch it, it's kind of magical, don't you think? Like wizardry. I would love it if someone used this pattern or drafting method to make their own pattern to do like a butcher block out of wood. You could do a Arizona state flag using this pattern, using wood to make a butcher block. Isn't that cool? That's one of my guilty pleasures, watching woodworking videos. Another one is watching stained glass videos. And I would love if an artisan would use this pattern to make an Arizona state flag, because you could do it easily. You don't have to account for seam allowance. You just cut your glass, cut all of your pieces apart. They're already numbered, and cut your glass to size. Wrap it, let it, and you'll have a beautiful 18 by 12 inch Arizona flag. Somebody do that, please. I don't have I've tried stained glass and I love it. I just try to focus on quilting right now. And woodworking, I would love to be able to make some of these things, but I don't have the space for the tools that I used to have, so I left my tools, and it makes me sad. I wish I had a huge wood shop or just craft area where I could do glasswork and woodworking and quilting and dyeing and weaving and spinning, all the things. So, if you have a friend that's into stained glass or woodworking, share this video. See if they'll make you something. All right, so we have all of our parts onto our paper piece patterns. Now it's time to square it up. So I have my notes reminding me to add the seam allowance. So on the inside there, I needed to add seam allowance, and on the outside corners, I don't, because I already have them included on the paper. So this side also needs a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I came really close, so I didn't quite leave enough on that red section, but we're going to make up for it. I ended up leaving like 3/16, and that's where the drafting is going to help me out. Okay, so I left my 1/4 inch seam allowances on those inside cuts, and then I'm cutting right to the paper on the outside cuts that include the 1/4 inch seam allowance. These are my 2 inside cuts, so I'm adding a 1/4 inch beyond the edge of the paper, and on the outside cuts, it's right to the paper. Sorry about getting my head in there, but when you are cutting your pieces, make sure you get your eyeballs right on top of the pattern so that you get a straight cut and that you have the space correct. So I try not to get my head in the way of the camera, but it often is, because you really do need to get your eyeballs right on top of your cut for accuracy. All right, so they're all cut. Let's see how they look. Those are my 2 bottom pieces and my 2 top pieces. So now we're going to sew the top piece to each of the bottom pieces, but because it's on an angle, we have to offset it. So the way I do angles is I just line up the edges that are going to be sewn together, and then I slide it until the V that's formed is equal to my seam allowance. So in this case, we're doing 1/4 inch seam allowances. So I want my dog ear to form a V right at a 1/4 inch. And because our seam allowances are not on the inside seams, we can see where to line it up. It's just going to be in line with the paper is where the V should be formed between your left and right. or your top and bottom piece. I hope that makes sense. I think I'm going to do a whole video on piecing angled pieces. A lot of people have problems with that. All right, so my paper's still on. I'm just sewing right next to the paper.
I'm at the end now, so
because both sides are cut to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So as long as I'm right next to it on one side, I'll be right next to it on the other side. I don't have to worry about damaging the paper at all. Looks like it came out pretty well. I'm opting to open the seam. You don't have to open the seam. I just decided to do that because the paper was still on there and it was causing it to be a little wonky, a little wavy, but that was more about the paper than it was about the fabric. But I wanted to leave it on as a stabilizer. Let's do the same thing with the other side and see how the edge came out straight on both sides. That's from, leaving that 1/4 inch dog ear off the edge before you sew the two pieces together. All right, now we have our left and right side. Now it's just a matter of sewing those two sides together, but we need to line up the center. We also need to line up at the bottom where the legs come together, and we also need to line up at the point on the top. And I like to use a 2-pin method when I'm aligning points that need to be pretty accurate. For the 2-pin method, I'm going to stick my pin right through where I want the stitch line to fall, so a 1/4 inch from the edge, which will be right at the edge of the paper in this case, and right through the seams that I want to align, which will be the center seam at the center of the star, the center seam between the two legs, and the center seam at the star point. So I put one pin in through each of those points and I keep that vertical, and then I'll take a second pin. Once I have those two pieces lined up on one pin, I'll take a second pin and pin across where that first pin goes through. That way I'm not tilting the fabric in any direction with the first pin. So I mentioned that I didn't have enough of a 1/4 inch seam allowance on the red on one side, but because of the way that we sewed our rays, the top rays nest with the bottom rays. And so I was able to use that nesting right here. I'm nesting, and that's allowing me to get a good lineup along the edge, even though I didn't have quite enough seam allowance down the center. And now, so you can see it right there, I'm ready to sew. And I slow down before I get to my pin. I try not to sew over my pins, but sometimes I get so close. And if I'm going slow, I don't have to worry about, a catastrophic event. So I did back tack at the beginning and end of that seam. It's kind of my finishing move. And now I'm going to gently peel my freezer paper away. And you see they're still intact. All the pieces are still intact. So I could use this freezer paper to make, a number of more blocks. I can usually get 5 or 6 blocks out of one set of freezer paper patterns if I keep it clean. So you can use your, what do I want to say here? You can use a lint roller on the back of your freezer paper to get some of that stuff off. If you use a lint roller on your fabrics before you use it with your freezer paper, that will help to keep it clean. And I just have water in my spray bottle there. I don't keep water in my iron anymore. I just use a mister and with just plain old water. I don't even use starch anymore. But this is how it turned out. I'm very happy with it. Of course, I'll probably do a solid fabric version, but there is my Arizona state flag. I hope you will give it a try. I hope you'll try to draft it, but if you don't want to draft it, I will have the pattern in my store. And there we go. Let's close out. So there you have it, the Arizona state flag in a 12 by 18 inch block that you can use for any number of projects. I hope you'll give it a try. I hope you'll try drafting it. But if you don't want to do all of that, I will have a pattern in the store. The bottom two pieces are too big for an 8.5 by 11 inch sheet of paper. So it is actually in two parts that you'll need to stick together. My recommendation for sticking it together is to use some type of glue rather than tape, unless you have a heat resistant tape, because you will need to iron on that paper and the tape if you use the tape. So there you go. I hope you'll give it a shot. I'll leave a link to my reference and to the pattern down below. But I hope you'll try drafting it yourself. See you later. Bye. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. See you soon.